We're now going to discuss a psychologist by the name of Julian Roeder. And in your textbook, you'll notice that the chapter is really on Walter Mischel and Julian Roeder, and Walter Mischel comes first. However, Walter Mischel actually was a student of Roeder's, so it makes more logical sense that we would talk about Roeder first. And Roeder really did make some important contributions to psychology. Roeder was in this group I mentioned earlier of people who really were interested in cognition. And at the same time, Roeder was a person who wanted to see how can we develop research models so that we actually can study this process of how personality develops when you consider that personality is so much determined by various cognitive experiences. And Roeder admits to being influenced by Alfred Adler and by Kurt Lewin, who was a prominent social psychologist. Now, two important concepts in Adler that appealed to Roeder was the idea that behavior is goal-directed and that there is unity in personality. Now, the goal-directed part is very important in trying to understand Roeder because that gave him a focus for some of his research. That is, his feeling was that behavior is directional, that you are trying to achieve something, you're trying to move towards something. The fact that he was interested in personality having unity, of course, created the problem that we noted like with Abraham Maslow, and that is if you talk about people in their complexity and you talk about personality somehow being unified, then you have the problem that you can't divide up an individual in kind of the segments, which we usually do in science, and study aspects of people. So this is kind of the struggle that will go on with Roeder, but he takes it on in a very good way. Now, he was influenced by this man, Kurt Lewin. And Kurt Lewin had a field theory approach to personality. And he tried to demonstrate that individuals are influenced by various forces that are in the environment around them. In fact, that was what Lewin really was interested in and kept his focus on, is understanding a person from the perspective of all the forces that go on in their interpersonal life and in their environment. And what Lewin said is that while there are forces around you, these forces have different strengths, and they can be tended to both with different intensities and different attractions, so that the environment around you actually is very complex. And Lewin felt that you really cannot understand people interacting in society if you don't understand their attraction toward the numerous social forces that are around them. For example, Lewin would feel that if you just look at a person's environment without understanding the forces around them, then you might end up making bad predictions. For instance, you might assume that somebody will choose someone that it's easier to reach if there are two desirable people that they might like to be with. But what we know is that even though there may be two desirable people that you might wish to go out with tonight, and let's say you can only go out with one of them, and one is right next door, and it would be easy to find out if they're available. The other one lives across town, and you're going to have to call them first of all and try to track them down, and then you're going to have to make a trip to meet them. But the fact is, while both are desirable and both have an attraction to you, you will have a preference, and you may have a preference for the person across town. So you may make that call and seek the person that you will have to go to considerable more effort to contact and to locate, because internally that person represents more of an attraction to you than the person who's right next door. Although the person who's right next door does represent an attraction. They're a nice person. You'd like to spend time with them. Now, what Lewin said is, when you look at the world of a person, there are all these kinds of forces. And you can't know someone just on the basis, let's say, of convenience, what is easiest for someone, because many people actually do the hard thing. And you can see that if you just watch their behavior in a given culture. Also, there are some people who choose to do things characteristically because it's easy. And so you might know that someone would rather be with the person across town, but because that requires a lot of energy, and our person doesn't like to put out a lot of energy, they choose the person next door, which is an okay choice, good choice even, but not the most desired choice. But unless you know about the sense inside someone of how they make these decisions, then you will not really be able to explain their behavior in the environment. Now, what Roeder did is he integrated both reinforcement theory, which obviously preceded him through a number of experimental psychologists like Skinner, and he combined that with cognitive and field theory. And the cognitive field theory was one that he really did get from Lewin. Now, Roeder's concepts are relatively simple and easy to understand. You will probably appreciate hearing that, since some of our people work at developing concepts that aren't so easy to understand. And he assumed that most of our behavior is learned, and that most of our learning is acquired through our experiences with other people. However, even though he says that, he does not believe that it is necessary to examine an individual's personal history in order to be able to predict their behavior. That is, history has an importance to him, but not the intense importance that it had to many of the other people we've studied. Now, this position is partly due to the fact that Roeder is going to focus more on behavior. And he does focus more on behavior than one's inner life. It's just that he doesn't neglect the inner life. And that makes him stand out from some of the people like Skinner, who, in order to be able to operationally define everything, decided to eliminate the inner life. Roeder felt you have to appreciate what is going on inside someone. Now, what is important in Roeder is that he posited a person's experiences and interpersonal interactions continually influence each other. So, all of us are constantly in a period of what we might call growth, or that we might call change, but our experiences are constantly influencing us in terms of how we will behave. So he did not hold that our current behavior is rigidly determined by the past. And in fact, he really allowed for current experiences to enable you to change what may be fairly fixed past behaviors. An example of this might be, he would say, you could have worked in the past for a number of hostile bosses and really learned to feel, I don't like bosses. And then you get a job in which you have a boss who actually is very good. And not only is the boss very good at helping the other people to do their job, but the boss is very nurturing and likable. And Roeder would say, a person can then learn not all bosses are the same. Up until this point, the person thought that, and they didn't like it. But one good experience, he would say, would allow a person to recognize that their former generalization is not true. And it would allow a person then to become optimistic about work. And some of our other theorists would have trouble accounting for this because, you know, one would say that you've been so negatively reinforced by relating to bosses that you're going to turn off the bosses. The really positive thing about Roeder is he would say, no, there's still something left in you that allows you to be open to new experiences. You can recognize changes, even though you may kind of have a generalized sense. Most bosses are not nice people. And the learning that might take place for this person is that they might then become aware you want to choose very carefully who you work for. Because most of the time, the people you work for you don't like. But it doesn't have to be that way. And that's the thing that's important for Roeder. And by the way, that also shows you, the sense that he thought of people as being healthy. Because the pathological person who had a series of bad bosses would have made the decision that all bosses are bad. Upon taking a job, they would assume they won't like the person they're going to work for. And by assuming they won't like the person, they probably wouldn't like the person. So the outcome would be that they would come into conflict with the person, no matter what the person did. And if you think in terms of pathology, then often you kind of get into that kind of thinking. If you think in terms of health, then you think in terms of possibilities. And you allow for your healthy person to be able to recognize something is new. And I like this that's new. I don't deny my whole past. I just recognize my whole past wasn't a good picture of potential. Now, Roeder also attempted to discuss behavior certainly in much more complex ways than people like Skinner did. For example, he noted that different behaviors are functionally related. For example, the example I just gave, would help you to appreciate that. And if you take a job, let's say before the person got this new job, they decided to do a number of things. They decided to apply for the job, and so they made an appointment to go for a visit. Then the person sends a resume in advance. And then the person calls a friend who knows the boss there and has the friend call the boss and make a recommendation because the person feels that will be helpful to me. And then they call another friend and have that other friend send a letter of recommendation. Now, if you think about this example, in each case, the person is engaged in a different behavior. They have called and made an appointment. They have talked to a friend about making a call. They have sent a resume. They've asked somebody else to write a letter of recommendation. But all these behaviors are functionally related to one goal, namely, our person wants to get a job. And what we learn with Roeder here is Roeder was trying to get us to see that there can be lots of behaviors in themselves. If you take them by themselves, they don't tell you very much. But if you know a more global concept, then all these behaviors, which are functionally related, make very good sense. Now, he also noted that reinforcements can become functionally related. We've just said behaviors can be functionally related. Next, he says reinforcements can be functionally related. Now, supposing, for example, we had a woman who was seeking the job we just described, and she gets the job. And the job becomes a source of income. I mean, that's why she went to work. She felt, I've got to make some money. So she goes out, she interviews, she gets all these people to help her, and she gets a job. And she got a job because she needed to make money. But then she gets on the job. And she finds out that this work is really very gratifying because she's good at it. And she's being very successful. So she is now enjoying work. Now that wasn't the goal of hers. She wasn't seeking work to enjoy it. She was seeking work because she really needed to make some money right now. And then this may be someone, let's say, who up until now doesn't have many friends. And in fact, she's rather a lonely person. But now she's at work, she's really enjoying work, and she's finding out there are a lot of people there that she likes. In fact, she's developing a real social life at work. And these are nice people. This is fun. So all of a sudden, she now has a social life which she didn't have before. It had nothing to do with why she sought this job. So if you look at our table up here, you can see that actually the one reinforcement she was seeking was income. Actually, she ends up with several reinforcements. She ends up with an interpersonal life. She ends up with doing things that are fun, like the job is fun. So in many ways, this particular decision on her part is going to have multiple reinforcers for why she should stay on this job. But originally, she never sought that, perhaps never even allowed herself to imagine it could happen. Now, there are basic learning principles that Roeder accepted. For example, he indicated that any stimulus complex has reinforcing properties to the extent that it influences movement either toward or away from a goal. So he's saying, you know, if a stimulus complex is going to have any meaning, certainly it's either going to be taking you toward a goal, or if your motivation is to get away from a goal, it's going to be taking you away from the goal. So what he generalized then is that all behavior is goal-directed, at least to some extent. Perhaps for us to be more precise, the term goal-directedness here is used when the focus is on environmental conditions that determine the direction of behavior. And the other variable you would want to keep in mind is that for Roeder, needs is ordinarily used when the focus is on the person determining the direction of behavior. So goal-directedness refers to the goal itself. Needs refer to the person who is determining what that goal will be. Now, there are problems that Roeder's theory ran into that we need to try to explain. First, social learning assumes that early goals are learned within a family setting. Specifically, social learning theory holds that it is parents or parent figures that satisfy basic physiological needs in childhood. Roeder even stated that it is the association we have with these people who have either satisfied or frustrated basic needs that causes us to rely on them or to rely on other substitutes later in life for the satisfaction of higher needs, such as affection and love and recognition. So the one role he's saying that's important in knowing the history of a person is if at the beginning of life the very basic needs were taken care of by the important people in life, one will develop a trust that as you move into other stages, like we might think of in Maslow's theory, where you want to be safe, you want to develop a sense of belongingness, you're looking for self-esteem, you're looking for intimacy. What Roeder would say is if your family took care of your basic needs, made you feel good as a kid, then what will happen is you will trust that people will help you with these higher order needs. On the other hand, if you didn't have good experiences then, you will struggle much more. Now, his theory about the need for parents to have been positive does present some problems. It assumes, first of all, that all reinforcers are effective because they are associated with what we call, drive reduction. And you will recall that drive is any strong stimulus that compels an organism to action. So it's that internal force in you that makes you want to do something. Now that's a drive. And in this particular case, when we talk about drive reduction, reduction means eliminating the stimulus that is reinforcing. By that, in its most basic way, you eliminate the stimulus that is reinforcing by satisfying it. So if you are hungry, that's the stimulus. If you're given food, then you don't have that anymore. So you have a reduction. That is, you no longer are experiencing that. And what happened then is Roeder was developing a theory of social learning, but he was trying to use these concepts. So to explain how we move from being reinforced through drive reduction to social learning, he simply posited that as we mature and life becomes more complex, the law of effect essentially replaces the law of drive reduction. And as you'll see, the law of effect simply says that behaviors are more likely to occur if they are positively reinforced. Now, one thing you can say about that is that sure is obvious. That's a pretty simple concept. It is more likely that you will do the same thing again if the first time you did it, good things happened. So in many ways, the more good experiences you have in life, the more likely you are to develop a broader repertoire of experiences, and the more likely you are to repeat those experiences because you kind of know if I do any of these things, life will be good. Now thus, you can see that the important focus then in this theory, which I've really mentioned, is that it is goal-directed behavior that is positively reinforced. And so goal-directed behavior becomes more likely to occur. Now, if you were to take this in the extreme, of course, you can imagine if every time you're seeking a goal, it's negatively reinforced, it's going to cause you to not have many choices about what you're going to do. Sure.
You said that as we mature and life becomes more complicated, law of effect replaces what?
The law of effect replaces the drive reduction theory. Drive reduction was, what was used. It's a very basic learning theory concept. But when we shifted over with Roeder to social learning theory, then this law of effect really becomes much more important in terms of what we experience and how we're motivated. Now, in your textbook, you'll notice that Dr. Allen notes there are 5 main concepts in Roeder's theory. And he focuses on reinforcement. By the way, I'll put all of these up. Reinforcement, reinforcement value, psychological situation, expectancy, and general expectancy. Now, reinforcement, a concept that you hear all the time in psychology, in this case refers to anything that has an influence on the occurrence, direction, or kind of behavior in which one engages. And what we're simply saying here is that you have to have some kind of experience in your behavior in order for you to be likely to repeat it or in order for you to be likely to avoid it. So reinforcement becomes very important. Now, but then he says, you didn't see reinforcement? Okay. Now, this is a concept you've seen many times because it certainly came up in Skinner. Okay, now the next concept is reinforcement value. And this is the degree of preference for any reinforcement to occur if the probabilities of many different reinforcements are all equal. So reinforcement value refers to the importance that we attach to different activities. It's the value that we give it. For example, and this can get complex, we might note that we want to attend a certain play. And then someone reminds us that there is another play also taking place. And all of a sudden we realize we're actually more interested in the second play. Thus, the choice of going to a play is very clear. I mean, you know that's what you want to do. But the value that we place on the second play causes us to make that choice, although we have quite positive feelings towards the first play. And it would have been interesting, or I should say it would have been rewarding if we had gone to the first play since we were open to it. But once we recognize choices, even within something that's desirable, it's the value we give to those choices that determines what we'll do. Now, this concept can get more complex. If you just take this choice now, we got a choice where we're going to go to one play. We find out there are a couple of plays, and actually we change our mind and we want to go to the second one. However, we may be going to the play with someone that we cherish. And that person may have preferred to go to the first play. But he or she goes to the second play with us because that person places a higher value on being with us than that person places on which play they see. So within a hierarchy of choices, if you don't thoroughly understand the situation in which you're trying to determine the strongest reinforcement value, you won't understand why somebody made the choice they made. In our example, you have a choice of two plays. And one person wants to go to one play, one person would rather go to the other play. But because of the values of these two people, both actually get what they want. That is, person one really wanted to see play two, and they got to see play two. Person two, more than anything else, wanted to be with us. So in order to have that, which is a higher order desire, they go to play two, they get the most important thing for themselves. That is, they get the companionship of someone that they really wanted to have. So what Roeder was saying, if you don't get into the complexity of these choices and you just kind of simplistically look at one variable, you won't understand what's going on in the social situation. Now, the next concept that we identify in social learning theory is psychological situation. Simply put, we're talking about the situation as it is defined from the perspective of the person. Now, this concept is central to Roeder's theory, and it really causes him to move away from many of the traditional learning theorists. It is this concept that allows Roeder to posit that the inner life of a person can greatly influence all the choices that a person makes. Some of you may be wondering if the lights just went on. That was a reinforcer. For some, it's a reinforcer. Some, it won't be. It is within this context that is understanding that each person is determining the value of something, that Roeder allowed for the possibilities that one will be influenced both by one's past experiences and the current situation. So he would say an individual might find herself in a situation, let's say, where she strongly disagrees with a friend. Ordinarily, if you were to look at the past behavior of this person, she would express her opposition because she really believes in stating her opinion. And if you were to look at her characteristic behavior, when she doesn't agree with someone, she says she doesn't agree. However, in this situation, she doesn't do that. So you wonder, if she's someone who expresses her opinion, she disagrees, why doesn't she express it? What would you say? Anybody going to guess? Why does the person not do it? Can you imagine anything? Sure. She wants to save the friendship. Okay. Did you have?
I was going to say kind of the same thing. She doesn't want to hurt the person's feelings.
Yes.
She doesn't want to make them mad.
Yeah. So what has happened here is that the psychological situation is more complicated than just the person's history. If we look at this woman, knowing that she's very outspoken, has real values, and that she's opposed, she would say, I don't agree with that. However, if she's with someone that she likes, and she knows one thing that this person can't deal very much with is criticism. That my friend is nice, gracious, good, but she doesn't handle criticism very well. I may then make the choice, even though I would be someone who ordinarily would not be this way, to not say something because I value this person's friendship. And so I behave what would seem to be uncharacteristically for me. But actually, if one would look at me carefully and to find that valuing friendships is very, very important, then making sacrifices might not seem so unusual. And that's where Roeder was really trying to help us to understand that the past of a person does tell us about them, but putting them in certain social situations may cause them to make a response that would be surprising to us. Now, expectancy is an important variable for Roeder, which he defines as a cognition or belief about the property of some other object or event. So we're talking now about your beliefs or your awareness of other objects or events. He would say such expectancies can range all the way from like 100%. You are absolutely certain this is going to happen, to 0. You are absolutely certain it is not going to happen. Then he would say expectancies can be changed through experience. Such experiences can either occur because we misjudged an event. Namely, let's say we thought that our favorite team will not do well this year, and so we don't anticipate or expect that they will do well, but they start winning. So we say to ourselves, well, I obviously misjudged because, this is not what was my expectation. And so, we are capable of learning that our original expectation was not accurate. Or we might even change our expectation. We might not have been failing to be accurate, but let's say our team made several trades, and now it has a much stronger team than it did before. So we rethink what our expectation is, because now we think, this team really has a chance, and they may do well. And Roeder was saying that, you you always have to be aware that processes like this are ongoing in personalities, that we are very capable of changing, that we're very capable of assessing, and that we are not profoundly overwhelmed by our past, that we can look at the changes that are going on and make changes ourselves to adjust. Now, social learning theory actually has developed 3 different kinds of expectancy. First of all, there are just simple cognitions or labels, like there is a bus, or there's a van, a car, etc. In other words, we simply name a stimulus. And he would say that that's one part of expectancy, that we can identify what's out there in the environment. Then he said, there are expectancies for reinforcement sequences. Excuse me, I skipped one. There are expectancies for behavior reinforcement outcomes. An example might be, let's say the person is wearing clothes that he or she believes will make them more attractive because they're going to meet a person. And the person they're going to meet, they really want to impress. Thus, the behavior is actually far more complex than what descriptors might be. That is, the behavior you observe is someone dresses up nice. Now, there could be all kinds of reasons for why they do that. It might be the only clothes they had then. It might be they like to dress up nice. It might be that that's just characteristic of what they do, etc. But in this example, there is a reinforcement the person is looking for. Namely, I am going out to meet someone who's important to me. I want to look very good because I want them to respond well to me. In other words, my dressing well is not reinforced by myself. My dressing well will be reinforced by the response of another person. Then, Roeder says there are expectancies for reinforcement sequences. For example, and this is where you get into the sequences, supposing I buy a business. And I might think, well, if I buy a business, I will have social recognition. I'll become wealthy. I'll be independent. And I'll enjoy what I do. I'll especially enjoy the boss that I work for, since I own the business. Now, here, there can be reinforcements that are not only multiple, but they come in a certain sequence. And also they may have differing times attached to them. And so the expectancy when it's involved with sequences may be that if you break down the various reinforcers, some of them will be more important than others, some of them will be more intense than others, some of them will last longer than others, but it's this whole sequence that causes me to buy the business. So if you thought I only bought the business to make money, you might miss like what my personality is really like. Because let's say it may be that the reason I bought the business was mostly because I wanted to be able to appear to be a successful person. And that may be more important to me than, let's say, the money that comes from this. So, Roeder, again, was trying to emphasize the individuality of people and the idea you do have to get to know individuals before you get involved in predicting. Now, this expectancy theory is very important, according to Roeder, in understanding behavior. He notes that having knowledge about how important a goal or a reinforcement is, that is, how important the goal is or the reinforcement is to a person, strangely enough, does not allow us to predict their behavior. That is, even though we know how important it is, if you predict solely on that basis, you will sometimes be wrong. And the reason is that an individual may have a powerful desire to achieve a goal. So you would assume that the person will surely go after that goal. But he says if the person has such a low expectancy that it is possible to achieve the goal, the person may not attempt it at all. So knowing that someone has a tremendous desire to do something, it will not predict that they will pursue it. At least this is what Roeder is saying. Unless you know that the person actually believes that they can achieve that goal. This becomes even more important and more likely to occur if at some time in the past the person actually sought the goal and they failed at it. Then even though the intensity remains that they would like to achieve this, they still probably will not pursue it. And we know this certainly in our social lives. I mean, and it may not be in your social life, but certainly you see it in the lives of friends and that, where someone really desires another person. I mean, you know he or she really wants to go out with this person, wants to befriend this person, wants to spend time with the person. And that's that person at this particular time, that's the person they most would like to pursue. But they don't do it. Why don't they do it? Why? Why does the person not do it? What is our theory saying? Yes, because they expect the person won't respond to them. Their expectation is so low that they'll be successful, that they don't go after something that the rest of us are saying, well, if you really want to go out with him or her, why don't you ask them? How often have you heard people say that to someone? And the person says, oh, well, I don't know, and, maybe I'm not sure. And well, what they're really saying is, I think I'll get rejected. Now, what Roeder is saying, this is a time when history does come in to play, because if you sought someone highly desirable earlier in your life, especially if it was fairly recently, and you got rejected, then and now your expectancy is that this person won't respond to you, you are even more likely then not to pursue the goal that you really want to pursue. So goal-directedness has to have some possibility of reward. And that possibility of reward, for the most part, is determined by your own evaluation of what the reward might be. And if you end up thinking you won't get rewarded, you don't do it. Yes?
So the expectancy for the behavior is like goal, and then expectancy for reinforcement is like in that case, like person get rejected in the past or something.
The expectancy is actually your internal sense of what it is you desire. That's what the expectancy is. The reinforcement is the experience that you have when you try to seek the goal. And of course, if you don't try to seek the goal, then there's no reinforcement. Does that?
No, I think he's asking what the difference is between expectancy for behavior and expectancy for reinforcement sequence.
I don't get the difference between outcome and a sequence.
Well, the first expectancy is you are responding internally to what it is you wish to seek.
So that's like goal.
That's right. You're responding to whatever it is that you would like to achieve. In the second situation, you're responding to whatever it is that happens. That is, you're responding to the event after you've sought it, or you've made some kind of attempt, or you've even made a decision not to make an attempt.
So like sequence, like more like history oriented or something like that.
Yes. Well, that's what Roeder was saying, is that part of it is determined by your history. I mean, you might overcome your history in this sequence. So you might have been turned down by someone, and you still might say, I'm still going to take the risk. But what he is saying is, why history comes in here is, you are more likely not to take the risk if you've already been hurt once or twice before. So that's where history comes into play. What is important in this theory is that history isn't determinative. That is, because you got turned down once or twice before, doesn't mean, therefore, you'll just never try again. But it does mean you'll probably be more hesitant. And so it will take more desire on your part before you would be willing to move forward with this. Now, the next concept may be helpful to you then, and it's called generalized expectancy. And what Roeder said is that as you look at expectancies, he posited that they may vary in terms of their generality. And that is, we may have certain expectancies that generalize to really quite a wide variety of behaviors. And other expectancies can be quite specific. For example, if you had gotten top performance ratings in one or two jobs, that might lead a person to feel, you know, I'll always be successful at work. I mean, I'm good at what I do. And so, you know, one would expect moving from one job to another, since I've always done well in my job and people always rate me well and I always do well, I'll do well at work. Now, on the other hand, if a person was, let's say, a very successful mechanic, but they found out that they did not do well selling insurance, and they even had a job working in a bank that did not go well. So that person may end up deciding that work will only be successful for me if I get jobs working with my hands. So the generalization is much narrower. Our first person, because of the jobs that the person has taken, was so successful, in fact, they've only known success, that it's very easy for them to generalize, I will always be successful at work. But for somebody who has had success and also found that they were not successful, they're not going to generalize to work. They're going to generalize to a subcategory of work, namely that subcategory where there really was positive reinforcement. Now, there are two less important concepts you need to understand within the framework of social learning theory. And they're called freedom of movement and minimal goal. Freedom of movement is defined as the mean expectancy of obtaining positive satisfaction as a result of a set of related behaviors directed toward obtaining a group of functionally related reinforcements. A fun definition, isn't it? The mean expectancy, that is the average expectancy, of obtaining positive satisfactions as a set of related behaviors that are directed toward obtaining a group of functionally related reinforcements. Now, in our next class, we're going to talk about this phenomena, and we're going to talk about a number of other phenomena in Roeder's theory. And then we'll go on to talk about how Walter Mischel made changes that were very important, or let's say improvements in this theory. But from now on, with the next several people, you're going to find that social learning theory is really become the theory in modern personality theory. In fact, it's become the theory in modern psychology in many ways. So we'll take that in our next class.